Good morning. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Hudson. My name is Marilyn Orr, President of the club, and we are thrilled to have you join us today. This meeting broadcast is available on HCTV, as well as our Rotary of Hudson YouTube channel and Facebook. Our club meets weekly using this digital platform, Zoom. When we meet in person, it's at Laurel Lake Retirement Community for breakfast. We hope to get back to that soon. We meet most Wednesday mornings from 7:15 to 8:30 a.m. So come out to join us for a meeting. We would love to have you as a guest. To learn more about Rotary, our club, and the impact we are having on our local community and the world, please visit our website, rotaryhudson.org. So enjoy this meeting today and help us share the message that Rotary opens doors of opportunity.
Go.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Hudson. Welcome to all of our guests that are joining us this morning. My name is Ron Strobel. I'm the Sergeant at Arms. Our invocation this morning is by Bill Woolridge.
Good morning, fellow Rotarians. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, in these seasons of Easter and Passover, there is so much to be thankful for. We are coming off a year-long pandemic, which has so greatly affected our lives. Thank you, Lord, for watching over and supporting us during this difficult time. And we look forward to when we can all get together again over our Rotary breakfasts and meetings. Our club and its members have been wonderful in stepping forward during this pandemic crisis. And now we are stronger and better as a result. Heavenly Father, thank you for protecting and being with us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bill. And lead us in the pledge and the four-way test this morning, Greg Box.
Morning, everyone. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, Greg. And now our president, Marilyn Orr.
Good morning, Rotarians and guests. This is absolutely my favorite time of year. And you know why? It's because the snowbirds appear. So welcome back, Ed Sogan and a few of the other people who like to winter in the South. It's wonderful to have you back home. The blooming trees and daffodils have put on quite a show this year, and I have made several trips to the Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, and it is in absolutely prime condition, especially Daffodil Hill. So I encourage you all to get out and to take a little drive and enjoy the scenery. You can do that on your bike too, you know. Last week, we heard about the gift of life, and I'm back this week to share with you a success story. Our cardiac candidate from Haiti received her life-giving surgery at Akron Children's Hospital last week. Her blood oxygen level before the surgery was in the 60s. That's really dangerous. This is a kid who couldn't play because of the difficulty she was having. After surgery, on room air, it registered 98. That's right where it needs to be. She can look forward to a normal life from this point on. We can be so very proud of our longstanding support of this project. I'd like to remind you that today we will be having a club board meeting immediately following this meeting, and all active Rotarians are invited to join us. And for now, we're going to let Jim Ahern introduce our speaker.
Welcome. Thanks, Marilyn. Well, this is, as you know, April is sports month, and this is just fantastic that Marla Ridenour has agreed to honor us with her presence. And I've been reading her articles for 20 plus years, so it's really kind of special. I mean, including this morning, there's a great article about the compressed schedule the NBA has for this season. But a little bit about Marla, and I'll let her take over. A little bit of bio. She became a professional sports writer on December 26, 1976, and she says that she became a sports writer because her boss told her that she got Christmas off. So she moved over to a sports writer. She's a Louisville, Kentucky native, 1978 graduate of Eastern Kentucky, degree in journalism and marketing. She was inducted into Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame in 2013. She's received a number of professional awards, one including the Eastern Kentucky University Alumni Association Award in 2019. She's the first woman sports editor of the Eastern Progress. While at Dayton News, she became the first woman to cover the Cleveland Browns in 1981. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that. And this is before the NFL mandated that teams open their locker rooms to females. So I'm sure she has some interesting stories there. She's covered Kentucky Derbies, Super Bowls, the British Open, the World Series, and the Great Cavaliers NBA Championship. I'm going to let her speak for herself. But Marla, it's so great to have you here. And as far as questions go, she says she's open to questions, I guess, at any time, right? So let us know if that's the case. There's a chat box. You can probably get questions on, or I guess if it's okay, you said just have people unmute and ask their question. So Marla, great having you here. It's all yours.
Nice to be here, although JB Bickerstaff won't recognize me with makeup on today. So feel free to ask questions if you want to raise your hand or send me a text. I mean, I think I'm good enough on Zoom to figure this out. But first of all, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about how I became a sports writer and covering, how I started covering the Browns, and then we can go from there with your questions. When I went to Eastern, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I thought I was going to be a physical therapist. And I was fine until I found out I had to take physics. I am not a conceptual person. I'm a numbers and letters person. So, I was doing pretty well in the sciences, but I started to freak out, and I went to the counseling center and did a bunch of aptitude tests and journalism was one of the things that came up. And what's funny is I was in like the 5th grade, and I did this big paper for my class on my career in journalism, and I cut the letters out of the newspaper to put on the front. And so it was sort of like a fallback decision. So then I was the sports editor of the school paper for 2 years. That helped me get to know a lot of the writers that worked at the Lexington Herald leader. And that's where I got that job in 1976. But I only covered primarily women's sports for 4 years. That's why they hired me. The University of Kentucky had just hired their first full-time women's basketball coach, Debbie Yao, who went on to be an athletic director at Maryland and NC State. So they needed a woman to cover the Kentucky Lady Cats, and it came down to 3 people. One was a high school women's coach. One was a lady who worked at the paper in the feature department, and me. And I said I was cheap and I did the best on the standardized test. They gave you a test back then. It was like the ACT test. And since I was still in school, I figured I had a leg up on those other 2 because I knew how to take a test. So anyway, I covered some small colleges and stuff there, but primarily it was all women's things. And then when I applied for the job at the Dayton Daily, I had no idea. After I got that job in 81, 6 months later, I was covering the Browns. That was I was sort of pushed on that because someone in the editor of the paper at the Lexington paper said he didn't think women can cover men's sports. And I mean, that sort of got back to me. So I figured I needed to start looking. So that's what happened. It's a funny story about when I first started covering the Browns. Sam Ratigliano was the coach. They were having their training camp at Kent State. And he calls me into this tiny little office. Oh my God, it was just like a little metal rat trap place. And he said, Art Modell has given his approval that you can go in the locker room. Because like you said in the intro, there was no mandate from the NFL that women had to be able to do this. So it was up to the team by team basis. He said, Art's gonna let you do this, but I want you to act like I would expect my daughter to act. So he came up with this plan for Sundays where there was a little tiny office outside of the locker room at Cleveland Stadium for him. And that's where the writers would go and talk to him first. And then you would go through this door that goes right into the locker room, right by the showers, the whole 9 yards. And I was supposed to yell, "Woman in the locker room," when I went through that door to let all the players know that I was in there. Well, this was years after the fact. I found out an interesting little nugget about that, which would probably be the first chapter of my book if I ever wrote one, was the players that were closest to the door all got together and made a pact that they would wait there and with their towels on around them. And when they heard me yell, they would drop them all at the same time. But I found this out when I was with a friend on Venice Beach, and I just happened to run into Elvis Franks, who was a defensive lineman for the Browns back then. He told me this story. He's like, "Let me tell you a story about Marla," and I have no idea what he's going to say. I mean, I have two friends, and I'm like, I'm looking at them like, oh my God, what is he going to say? Well, he said they gave up after a few games because I never noticed. And I sort of developed a thing where you would scan the locker room by looking at the people from their nose up, just like you're casing the room, so to speak, to look for your guy that you need. But you have to but I was so paranoid when my boss gave me the assignment to cover the Browns. He said, "I don't want you to make any headlines." So I was so paranoid about, making headlines and all that and, creating a controversy that I sort of learned how to scan the place without seeing anything significant. Sometimes it was inevitable. You're walking right in and that shower's right there. But like I said, it was quite a balancing act. What's funny about it is there was a story in the Plain Dealer. Actually, there's a picture of it up above my head of me interviewing. They did a story on me back in, the 81 season. And also there was a Browns News Illustrated, a weekly publication that was where I read the most criticism of me covering the Browns. And it came from the players' wives because they actually thought I was there looking for a husband and wasn't there for professional reasons. I thought that was very interesting. I also once had a conversation with Chip Banks, the Browns linebacker, about that, who he thought the same thing. He says, "You can't be really serious about doing this as a career. I'm sure you're going back and telling your girlfriends all about us." And, it was just, he couldn't fathom that I would want to do this for a living. But I was there for 9 years. Then I got to go to the Columbus Dispatch. I covered the Browns for them. When the Browns left town, I did the Bengals. So I was able to do all the Super Bowls in a row there for a while. And what was interesting, and it was kind of a throwback, because at my first job, in Dayton, I got to cover the Bengals Super Bowl, the 1981 one. And that was when Joe Montana nobody knew who he was. And I'm kneeling at his feet in the locker room after the game because we were an afternoon paper. There was hardly any media, especially after the game because of the deadline situation. But it was also interesting because that season, the Bengals didn't allow women in the locker room either. So I had to cover the opponent throughout the whole playoffs. And there was I'm pretty sure it was the game when, it was the Freezer Bowl or whatever they call it in Cincinnati, where they were playing the Chargers, and I'm getting ready to dash in the door at the Chargers, and Chuck Muncie's sitting there, and he gives me this look like, "You're really coming in here?" He didn't say a word. I just zipped right past him, and he didn't say anything. And I wasn't waiting around to ask for permission, because if I didn't get in there, I had nothing. So anyway, like I said, I spent most of my career there in Columbus writing about the NFL. That was the first time I had actually been a full-time writer. In Dayton, we also had to work the desk, lay out pages. So it was a great thing for my career to be able to write full time for Columbus. And then I came to the Beacon Journal in 1999. My first assignment for them was covering Ozzie Newsome's induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And, you know, I knew Ozzie very well. So it was funny because that was the year that it was so significant to me, and I'll always remember is he was and he was paranoid because of leaving to go to work for the Ravens. And during the parade, he heard like fireworks and he thought they were gunshots of someone trying to, you know, shoot at him. And because they had an open, you know, aired car. So like I said, Ozzie and I were pretty good friends. I was even able to get a hold of him after Marty Schottenheimer died recently. And he said, you know, I'm not talking to everyone today, you know, but he considered our relationship special. So I was lucky there. At the Beacon, you know, they made me the columnist, and I can't remember what year that was, but unfortunately right now I can't write a column every day. We've got so much going on and so few full-time people. I'm kind of the Cavs beat writer. I help out on the Indians. I go to I went to all the Browns home games during the pandemic, just because those people, I mean, I've covered the Browns for so long. Those people are like my family. And I figured if I was going to venture out into the COVID world, it was going to be to see them. So anyway, but like I said, if anybody has any questions, feel free. Anybody yet have anything they want to know?
I'll ask you
Yeah.
this.
Go ahead.
With the Browns being so horrible, for like statistically impossible for them to be that bad that long, did you ever think about changing careers?
No, because believe it or not, sometimes the stories are better when they're not any good. I just remember even like back in the day when Belichick was the coach, you know, Michael Dean Perry was always complaining about the 2-gap scheme. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think there's somewhat of more of a camaraderie between the media and the players if you're sort of suffering through this together.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you this. When I was in Columbus, I think I figured out my winning percentage with the Browns and it was in the 4s. So, but I also had an interesting conversation with Belichick. It was during the preseason one time. My boss wanted me to sort of have a clear the air meeting with him. And I tried to convince him that we really do want the team we cover to win. I mean, you know, there's a better mood. Everyone's happy to come to work that day. You know, it's just like, you know, it's a better atmosphere, you know, but I never could talk him into it. That we were actually not rooting, but we wanted the team to succeed. I mean, people even ask me now, like, when are you going to retire? And I'm like, well, I kind of want to go to the Super Bowl with the Browns just because I feel like I've invested my whole life in this, and it would be, you know, kind of a good way to do it.
So do we, Marla. So do we.
I do have another funny story about Belichick while we're on that subject. What's interesting is, you could be in I'm driving there from Columbus, and you could be in a great mood, listening to music in the car. 5 minutes after he starts talking, you know, the day's sort of shot, just to hear him mumbling and not answer and all that kind of thing. But during the Bill Must Go era, I wrote a note in the paper that the Brecksville police were guarding his house. And the PR guy comes in, he read everything. Like the PR department, like got all the clips of the day's stuff. And then they would yellow highlight all the bad parts. So the PR guy comes into the press room. At that time, we had a press room in Berea that overlooked the practice field. And he's like, Bill's going to call you. And our press room had a pay phone. He says, Bill's going to call you on the pay phone. So it rings. I go in this little booth, and he is livid about me putting this thing about the Brecksville police in the paper. I didn't use his address. And this went on for like seemingly like he chewed me out what seemed like a half an hour. I'm sure it wasn't that long, but finally I get to the point where I want to hang up on him, but I don't want to hang up on him because it seems unprofessional. So finally I said, I apologize. I said, Bill, you don't know me very well. If you think I would do anything to endanger you or your family, but I think we've basically said all we can say to each other. So I guess technically I did hang up on him, but anyway, I don't know. It's something I do believe, like he developed a good relationship with Tony Grossi after the fact. I do believe he sort of looks maybe upon us in a little better light than he did back then. I think it was the first Super Bowl he won. I went to New Orleans and stayed with a friend. I wasn't covering it. And after the game, they were staying at the Roosevelt Hotel, and they were having a big party in the ballroom. And I'm sitting at the bar waiting for my girlfriend to come back, from getting done writing. And he comes walking in the bar and he sits down with his neighbors from Brecksville. And I sat there at the bar through a couple Sazeracs before I got up the nerve. I'm like, should I go congratulate him? Should I not? He's not going to want to see me. Finally, I go up there and I tell him that was the year that the Patriots won with all those defensive backs getting injured and receivers had to play DB. And it was a 3-point game, I think. And I told him, I said, Bill, I'm probably the last person you want to see, but this is probably your best coaching job ever just for all you've been through this season. And I think by the time I got my spiel out, he was appreciative that the fact that I came over there. So, but you're not supposed to be friends with the coach, but you're also supposed to have a good working relationship. So that I think we finally got to that point.
Marla, I'm convinced that if the Browns hadn't left Cleveland back in the 90s, we would have been to a Super Bowl or two already. But beside that, how close do you think, and what how close were we to that not happening? Were we close, or was it inevitable that the Browns were going to move?
I think it was inevitable, and only because, and I was really livid about this. I don't know if I've told this to that many people, but I mean, this was all the people in the State House in Columbus knew this was happening 6 months before. But I'm like, well, if you'd have told me, I might have been able to make some noise about it and got some people, just the manner that the way this was going on behind the scenes, this wasn't out of the blue. So I think it was inevitable. I really do. I was at that press conference in Baltimore in that parking lot. And I remember I'm sitting next to this TV guy and I said, please don't let me throw up on national television, because I knew it was going to be such a spectacle and everybody was going to be so happy. And back in Cleveland, everyone's, hearts are breaking, but I really don't think my problem with it was, like I said, if he'd come out and let him know he was unhappy and we needed a new stadium and this and that, I think there would have, it could have all worked. Like, the Bengals used that as leverage to get a new stadium because of what happened to Cleveland. So, but I just think that the other thing was Art never did anything by himself. He had like a committee of people around him. And I also think his family was very influential in this. Like, his wife, saying, we got to do this for our kids. And, that kind of in the grandkid, that I do think it was part of the, he was an owner, but he was always borrowing money. God, he had to borrow money to sign Andre Rison, like it would financially, it was always living on a shoestring. So I just from what I knew, when I found out that about the people in the Columbus, the capital of Columbus knew long before, because the guy that owned the paper back then, it was a family-owned paper by the Wolfs, John Wolf, apparently got wind of it long before we did.
Oh, that's too bad.
Hi, I was just going to say, it must have been a closely held secret, because a good friend of mine, Gary Gottfried, who was working in publicity for the Browns, said that he was completely surprised by it as well. So all of a sudden, his team's not there anymore. But Actually, I had a different question. Yeah, it's funny because you look at a lot of sports reporting, particularly on TV, and it always seems to be the same 4 or 5 questions they ask players, or who do you think is going to win? Should they pass more? Should they do this? It's just kind of what I'd like to know is how you're able to get more depth from when you talk to players, really get beyond kind of the initial, who's going to win, or how do you feel about this or that?
Well, part of me thinks some of us are doing that. It's just that they're not showing that on TV. But let me tell you this, that's kind of like what I like to do, is more like write about features and write about people and their stories. So the one thing I will tell you, in the professional ranks, all these, it's rare to have a one-on-one anymore, just because there's so many media and, plus, the pandemic, it's all on Zoom. But before that, you have to call someone, you pull someone aside in the locker room. And, I have had good luck with that. I think guys, even like before the pandemic, we put out a magazine on the Browns for the last 2 years. I did a story about Myles Garrett, his generosity, behind the scenes. And I talked to him one-on-one at minicamp. And after he walked away, the PR guy said he really enjoyed it, because it wasn't anything about football, really. It was just about, his life and, how he likes the outdoors and his dog and, just that kind of thing. So I do think there is a place for that. And I will say this, the Browns really went out of their way during the pandemic to get us guys on the phone. So we actually did some of our best, in-depth, like one-on-one stories with players over the past season, just because we were able to do that. But part of me, what your question about, we were always seeing the same answers, I kind of blame the TV people for that's what they're using, what snippets they want to put out there. I mean, they don't, and also they have time constraints, like you're not going to be able to tell a guy's story in the few seconds you have in a sports cast. So I do feel like we're trying to go and tell the stories that you don't see on TV, and, the stories behind the stories. That's kind of what we're trying to do. And I'm hoping the fact that the Browns have been so good about this will continue even once we are allowed back in there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's why I enjoy the print writing, yourself, Terry Pluto, people like that, rather than, on TV. Like you said, they just seem to get that sound bite, and it's really not really very informative, or interesting.
Well, yeah, there's things on like ESPN where they go and do a deep dive on some guy, but that's about, I think it's more on, print and online, there are certain websites that, do that and devote more. But I think that's what people want. And because even now, we're all trying to, convert from game story and go behind, and go more in depth and analyze. And, it's changed in that regard.
Marla, I have a 2-part question. And one is, what is the story of how Johnny Manziel ended up with the Browns, and what were the feeling with his teammates about him? I don't know. You hear a lot of things, but you don't know. And secondly, is any thoughts you have about the Browns' upcoming draft?
Well, I really don't know the Johnny Manziel behind the scenes part of it, but I will say I think it had to be Jimmy Haslam. I don't think anybody in their right mind with a logical brain would have picked Johnny Manziel. Also, because of his off the field, issues, drinking, just, all that kind of stuff. I feel like there was a story, I think that came out of New England about, they knew what kind of guy he was. So, to me, it took so much more, you have to, they're digging up all this stuff on all these guys they might draft. So how could you overlook that? It just doesn't seem like a football guy would do that. It seemed like an emotional decision. And there was only I'm not going to name him, but there was only one guy who really criticized him openly to the media, but he was just appalled by his work ethic. And, just like, he said like guys were trying to help him and teach him how to be a pro, but he just wasn't, going for it. I will say that one of the things I remember most about Johnny was, it was when he got to be a starter, and he was a big Cavs fan, so he would sometimes go to the Cavs games in person. But this was a big game coming up, and I said something to him about the Cavs, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't go last night. I stayed home and watched it on TV." But that was like on a Wednesday when you're supposed to be studying your plays, and you know what I mean? Like that's the night. That's like one of the biggest nights of the week for a quarterback is to, do your game preparation and get ready because Thursday is the last big practice of the week to get all this down. And he was sitting at home watching the Cavs on TV. So I just don't think, it was an ill-fated, and not just for the circus part, but, just the fact that, what happened with texting the sideline to put him in and all that tells me, this was like an owner's move from the start. This year's draft, I'll be surprised if it's not a defensive player, a cornerback or a defensive end, I would say. If they sign Jadeveon Clowney, that might make a difference as far as which position. Personally, I want him to take a linebacker, but you have to understand that these and even in these mock drafts, they don't really understand that the Browns are really, into the analytics side, and there's a value on who, has the most impact in the first round, and it's not a linebacker. Linebackers are sort of being devalued in the NFL because if you have a good defensive line and a good secondary, they're kind of just filling in the gaps. So my guess it would be a corner, only because also, Denzel Ward, from Nordonia he's a great player, but he's also always banged up. So, you have to consider that. He's going to be coming up for a contract extension soon, but you have to consider if he gets hurt one more time, you might have to look for, that too. So if I was betting the house, I would probably say it's a corner, but I would also, there's a lot of good defensive ends. And even if you do sign Clowney, you're going to need the young guy that's going to be opposite Myles Garrett for years to come. So they could find one of those they liked. I wrote a lot about those two guys from Miami, just partially it intrigued me because they were both coached by the guy, who used to be an Akron U assistant, Todd Stroud. So, but there's there could be some good defensive ends falling into their lap there. The other thing I would think is they have to have speed. Speed has to be the emphasis of this draft in several rounds, not just the first round. So that could also influence the corner, if it's a cornerback or not. Oh, here's a question about how many women are sports writers in the U.S., and I cannot tell you that answer. I will say it's becoming less of a big deal, so to speak, just because there's so many women in the broadcast fields now. And I'm trying to think, 2 women that, beat writers, if you count me as a columnist / beat writer on the Browns now. The interesting thing to me is, like, now it's for the players. I think they have so many women writing about them in college. I don't think it's like, they don't see it as like we're invading their turf anymore because they're used to it. They've been interviewed for a lot. Most of these guys who are playing in the NFL been interviewed since they were in high school, and they've dealt with female reporters for years and years. So it's not that, but I have no idea how many there are. I will say this, when I started my first job in 1976, we had 3 women on the same newspaper staff at the Lexington Herald Leader. One was the horse racing writer, And the other two of us, you know, kind of did every jack of all trades and did colleges and high schools. That has to just be unbelievable. Here's a quote about Kevin Stefanski. I'm kind of blown out of the water by Kevin Stefanski, but part of me thinks it's just because of the contrast with the previous coaches, especially Freddie Kitchens. I mean, there's this aura about Kevin Stefanski that maybe I didn't realize it on the first day, but just his leadership and his, you know, how well-spoken, his presentation, he's so smart. It's not a flying by the seat of your pants thing with the Browns anymore when it comes to the coach. And I think that also shows in the fact of who he was able to get on his coaching staff, like getting a guy like Bill Callahan to come here and coach the offensive line. I don't think a guy that isn't the real deal is going to be able to hire the best offensive line coach arguably in the NFL right now to come here. So I do think, it isn't that I thought all of those guys were incompetent or, you know, that kind of thing. But I do think they got a keeper. I really do. And like there was someone who just mentioned about Howie Baker and Odell. That was one of the things that I thought was most striking about the Freddie Kitchens one and done year was you could tell by the end that Odell and Jarvis had no respect for Freddie. You could just the reading between the lines of, and part of it was just how disorganized they were on offense, on game day, you know, kind of the circus on the sideline. I do think Stefanski has the command of all these guys. And I think it said a lot to Baker Mayfield that he flew down to Texas to meet him before everything shut down with, you know, the pandemic and spend some time with him just to start developing that relationship. Because if you look at the history of the league, you know, like Tom Brady and Belichick or whatever, this has got to be a foundation of trust and, you know, respect. And he wasted no time. He was down there, I think within the first month on the job. Also saw a question about paying college players. I would hope that that's coming soon, especially as far as, you know, the autographs, using their likeness on clothing, you know, that getting a bulk of, you know, jersey sales or some percentage or something. It's funny because I remember when I was covering the 2002 Buckeye Championship game, Mike Doss, who's from Northeast Ohio, Canton, I think. He had a public speaking class and his presentation was why college players should be paid. That was in 2002. We're still sitting around talking about this, you know, this many years later. So, I think it's on the players' minds. I feel like they do feel like they have a little bit of more of a voice now as far as being able to push for this. You know, there was that thing, I think about Northwestern about having a union or something. I think that part will get done, although I've never had a whole lot of dealings with the NCAA, but they are like moving like a snail. It's pulling teeth to even get information, much less change. So that could be a little bit of a fight, but I do think that's coming.
How do you think it would impact high school recruiting when that's a factor of going to a school that may promise and be able to promise more money?
I do think that's an issue. That would really force, you know, even the MAC schools to, you know, take some look. You're going to be looking for diamonds in the rough and maybe guys with grade issues or, you know, checkered past or, it's not to say you can't, those guys still aren't out there. I think they are, but your 4 and 5 star guys are going to go where they can get money. I'm sure that's probably the biggest holdup right now is how can you make this fair? Would you have to make the playoffs? bigger to give some of the littler guys, or, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that's the internal debate going on. It's just, how are you going to stop from creating this upper echelon that's a different level of competition?
Marla, I worked for Art Rooney for a number of years, and I'm a diehard Steeler fan, obviously. I wonder what you think of the current management regime versus the era of Dan Rooney and then Art Rooney Sr.
You're referring to the Steeler management?
Yes.
Well, I mean, the Rooneys were so unusual. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I haven't had as close a relationship with them. Like back when it was the era that you were, referring to, I used to go to the NFL owners meetings, and, so we got to be, a little tighter. Now Nate Ulrich does that for us. So, but I would maybe question some of their decision-making, like keeping Ben, or not. I mean, this is the year you need to draft Ben's replacement, and, or whatever, find someone else younger. I don't know, that kind of, like I said, I would more question their decision-making than I would of the past. I do have a good story about Dan Rooney. I had one time I interviewed him one-on-one in his office, and at the end, I'm telling him, I'm driving back. I think I was driving back here to Akron, Cleveland. And I said, I have never been to Pittsburgh and not gotten lost getting it out of Pittsburgh. And so he picks up a piece of paper off his desk, and he draws me a map of the stadium, and like, here's, you do this. And it's the only time in my life, hardly, before, you had it on your phone, that I got out of Pittsburgh without getting lost. I mean, one time we were trying to get to Station Square, and I ended up at Pitt Stadium. That's how bad, it was. So, I mean, he was such a nice man. And we also used to run into him, like, we would park in the medium parking lot up on the hill that sort of overlooks the stadium. And we would run into him all the time walking to the game. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
So I mean, I just have a more of it seemed like more of a family then, with, during that era with him. But, that was it's also the same way with the media and the players. I mean, that has all sort of evolved and changed. But, I guess I will look fondly on that. Although the Steelers were another one of those teams when I started that wouldn't let me in the locker room. I was covering a playoff game, and Bradshaw was the quarterback, and Leslie Visser and I are standing outside the locker room to try to get like 5 minutes with Bradshaw, and he stiffed us. So I can't remember who they brought out, but, it's always like, it changes your whole mindset of what you're going to write, because they didn't. But other than that, as far as them they weren't like on the cutting edge of women in the locker room. I had a lot of respect for the old regime, the old guard there. So, we'll see where they go from here. I kind of feel like this is a crossroads for the Steelers. Kind of, lots of people passed on Ben. I mean, there's a lot of big decisions that need to be made, and, are they going to be able to keep these guys? And, how is it going to be? It seems like they're, getting passed by some of the pack in the division. So we'll see.
Pretty cool year.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions?
There's one from Ed Sogan on the chat box.
Oh, okay. Hold on a minute. I would blame the front office from, I guess the roller coaster of the coaches. It's got to come from the owners. I mean, I guess what's been most mind-boggling to me is just, especially during the Haslam era, I guess I sort of have gone more and more down the path even with Pilot Flying J, that had to be his dad was the brains behind the operation. I mean, it's like, how could you have such a successful, I'm not getting into the scandal part of it, but such a successful corporation and make so many bad decisions in hiring. But I think part of the issue is when you've been in another business and you're coming to football, it's sort of a hobby and you go with your heart too much and you don't make the logical decisions. You don't look, they interviewed Kevin Stefanski and you still went with Freddie, it's like you're letting your heart rule the place instead of your head. So I'm sure some of those coaching moves, had John Dorsey obviously picked Freddie. So you would blame that on him saying he hopes, but I would say all the rest of them were on the owner. And that's even goes to firing Belichick. Remember when they moved to Baltimore, he was fired on Valentine's Day and Belichick was. And the only reason I remember is I was flying to London to meet some friends and I was in the airport in Philadelphia when it came on ESPN that Belichick was fired. And I mean, Art didn't like Belichick because he wouldn't look him in the eye in the hallway. So, I mean, people don't understand that some of these owners are just, he had him on the cusp of the playoffs, that kind of thing. So, I like I said, I'm putting the blame on the owners on this. Here's a question from Marilyn. What advice would you give a young person? I'm very, very clear on this one. I say almost the same thing every time I speak to a young group. You have to read. You can't, and I don't care if it doesn't have to be reading the newspaper. You need to read books, you need to read magazines, you need to read online articles. Because arguably, some of the best people in our business are reporters and not writers. But if you want to be a writer, you can't learn how to write unless you read. You don't understand what the rhythm of a sentence is. You don't understand what's captivating. I have a few little tricks that I tell young people too. Like, if you can't decide what your lead should be, just pretend you're calling your mom on the phone. And what would be the first thing you would tell her about this game? Like, I one time covered I think it was a game of John Carroll where it was so muddy, the coach fell down and got on the sideline during the game. And that was what my lead was. And because that's what you would go back and tell your mom or your friends or whatever. But the other thing I would tell them, and this is the most daunting part of our job now, is you're not going to have the weekend off. I didn't have the weekend off for a whole year until I got qualified for vacation. This is a 12-hour a day, 24/7 business now. You have to love what you do because it's absolutely grueling. Like tonight, for example, the Cavs play at 7. I'll probably get done at 3 a.m. So, and that's because you're writing a story for the internet after the game and you're responsible for posting it yourself. You have to get the pictures and write the headlines and, edit the thing. And maybe I'll be lucky. If I'm lucky, I'll be done by 1:30 because it is an earlier game. But like the night that they played the Lakers and LeBron, I was writing until 5 because I talked to LeBron briefly about what he's doing for Akron. And, I was writing multiple stories that night. So you have to love this and you have to be, I have someone that I really wanted the Beacon Journal to hire. She was a student at University of Kentucky and that I met back in the day a few years ago. She ended up dropping out of the thing altogether. And she's just a freelancer, lives in Kansas City, covers soccer because she didn't want to put up with the hours and having no personal life and, not seeing your friends. And so be willing to work hard, work 12 hours a day and give your life to this at least until you get started. That's what I would say. But I will say I emphasize the reading thing all the time. And it doesn't matter what you read. It's just that you need to read good writers, even if it's some blog or something of someone you admire.
Marla, you hear a lot locally, at least, about the fan base, particularly for the Browns. And they say it's the best fans, and you hear that probably every city around the country. But is there anything to the pride that we have as far as the Browns fan base as compared to anywhere else, or do you have a feel for that?
No, I agree with that. I mean, shoot, I even think it applies to the Cavs. Look at how bad they were for a while, and there were still people going to the games. I just feel like it's a little bit of the, like you were talking, when we were talking about how it is to cover a losing team. There's just this bond and this passion and this fervor that just gets stronger and stronger the more you suffer. And granted, part of those crowds in the Muni lot are just people that want to, party like crazy before kickoff. But there's this, I mean, I'll tell you a story about, I'm trying to remember where I was even working. We went to, I was in London and I went to interview Steve Cawthon at a racetrack, and it might have been when the Browns were there they played the Eagles in that American Bowl back in the day. I had to take a train to go to the racetrack to interview Steve Cawthon. So that was in the 70s or early 80s. I must have been in Dayton. But I get on this train. You have to change trains in Cambridge. I'm thinking, I'm never going to find this racetrack by myself. And then I'm sitting on the train with this guy who's a Browns fan who was coming to sit in the dog pound that season, all the way from England. And so he had a car set up to pick him up at the train station to take him to the racetrack. So he actually took me with him to the track and told me where to meet him to go back after the races. And all he talked about was how excited he was, is that he was coming over there this fall to go sit in the dog pound. So, I mean, that just shows you, that blew my mind. Number one, that's one of the most incredible coincidences ever. But that just shows you the reach of this team. And, there's fans all over the world who are smitten with these underdogs and can't wait to see them do it. I mean, when you think, I think it's only 3 teams that haven't been to the Super Bowl now. I know Detroit is the only other one that's not an expansion team, I think. So there's just this bond that, I mean, I remember going back in the day when, the Browns backers are big, and we would go to Los Angeles and there'd be like 10,000 people in the stands from the Southern California Browns backers. I mean, other teams in the league don't have that kind of support. It's really something cool to see. The Football Hall of Fame, boy, I do think that is huge to this region. And I have a neighbor who's working down there, sort of calls on people down there in that area. He says it's fascinating to see this Hall of Fame village. I think that's going to be a huge, I think it's a big attraction already, but I think it's going to be even bigger when they sort of develop that area into sort of more of an entertainment district and kind of because I'm trying to think of how many times I've been inside. I mean, I covered several induction ceremonies, but I haven't been through it just to see it for myself in several years. But I mean, they really are, putting an emphasis on kind of interactive things and, different things to, and draw the younger generation. So I really do think that's a big thing. And I mean, just think, if you come here, you can go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I think there's sort of it really does enhance people wanting to come to Northeast Ohio. So I would say that's very important. And I'll be curious to see what they can, what kind of draw it will be when they get this, this village and this entertainment complex, the construction is completed.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And if someone doesn't have one, I do.
Go right ahead.
Okay, and that actually is looking more towards the future of where how women's involvement with sport. You know, we've always, there's a great disparity among pay, among things among tennis players, and you know, a number of like the women's basketball versus the men. Do you have any comments on that? And is there a disparity among pay among the sports writers as well?
Oh, I would think so. I haven't had a raise in 20 years, so so I would say yes. I mean, but that's also this part of the sad state of journalism. But I mean, I often thought when they gave me the column job that I should have been more forceful and asked for a raise then. But I mean, it's kind of like you don't want to put your head out on a limb in the uncertain times of the journalism business.
Yes.
Do think that I do see, as far as professional women athletes go, I think the future is looking up in that regard. Just because, you know, you see people like Serena and, you know, the women's soccer players and basketball players. I do think the audience is becoming broader. And I will tell you, I mean, it's incredible for me to see, because back when I started covering women's sports, they didn't want to be criticized because they wanted me to be a cheerleader for women's sports. And even though I was going to cover their team like I covered a men's team. You know, like if I saw something I didn't agree with, you know, I tell people all the time, my biggest disagreement ever in my career was not with that Belichick phone call, was with Debbie Yao. I wrote a critical column about how she was using the players like in the late 70s, and she was, you know, crushed and never spoke to me without a tape recorder after that. So, but I do think I see such strides with the women's sports and the popularity. Even back then, I was covering games that had 5,000 or 6,000 people in the stands when they were playing the big time teams, you know, like Tennessee. And I think it's just exploding in popularity. And I know a lot of people who enjoy the women's basketball game more because it's more of a team, you know, less isolation and more, you know, engaging as a team kind of thing. So I think it's looking good on the front, but I don't know about the pay disparity in journalism. I don't know. I mean, obviously the women like, you know, Doris Burke and the women on ESPN, I think they're helping break those barriers down, because you just see how good they are. But that could be, I mean, I sort of feel like for the writers, that's going to be a ways away.
Okay, thank you so much for being with us today. This was absolutely terrific.
Well, I hope I told you a few funny stories. I appreciate you
did.
having me.
You said you did.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to hang up now, but thank you so much for the invite.
Sure. Wasn't this awesome? Well, tomorrow the Scout Cabinet Committee is meeting at 8 a.m. Via Microsoft Teams, as well as at the Scout Center on Hudson Drive. On Friday, the Gala Committee will be meeting at noon via Zoom, and a quick link will be sent for that the day before. Next week, we're going to be hearing from the Hudson High School Athletic Director, Mike Chupa. He will be getting us up to speed on the athletic programs there. So we're going to close it out. And I'm telling you, this is one of the busiest days in April in history. In 1828, the first American dictionary is registered its copyright. That would be Noah Webster. In 1865, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth. He will die tomorrow morning, later in the day. In 1902, J.C. Penney opens his very first store in Kennemer, Wyoming. In 1912, the U.S. Titanic hits an iceberg. In 1981, the first space shuttle, Columbia 1, returns to Earth. And in 2003, the Human Genome Project is completed with 99% of the human genome sequenced to an accuracy of 99.99%. And lastly, in 1939, The Grapes of Wrath is published by John Steinbeck. one of my all-time favorite books by one of my all-time favorite authors. So have a great day, and thank you so much for being with us this morning. Wasn't she just awesome?